Dear colleagues or friends or students, thank you, Dr. Radhakrishna, for giving me yet another opportunity for to talk in this forum. Today, I'll be talking about intra-abdominal infections. Other terminology used is also called as intra-abdominal sepsis. I just thought I'll quote this. When you move your focus from competition to contribution, life becomes a celebration. Never try to defeat people, just win their hearts. And I optly believed, and I thought Professor Chandramohan is one of the examples for this, that contribution, and that was what was his nature of celebration of his activities. Intra-abdominal infection or sepsis is one of the most challenging situations. You know, the mortality is as high as 4 to 40%. Depends on the surgeon's factor how much he's experienced in handling the emergency situations of sepsis, how bad or how good is the patient, how comorbid are the conditions, what type of a sepsis is this. Look at the stomach to colon. Stomach is relatively a sterile structure. Colon, you can see the bacterial population of 3.9 into 10 to the power of 10, and that to more than 1,000 species. And how good is your intensive care unit anesthetist or ICU specialist? So today I'll be only concentrating on the gastrointestinal sepsis. So other part I'll be taking it in some other time. Some of the headings I have already given you here. Let us go into a few of these terminologies, and so that it will be easy for a postgraduate to write the full essay and to understand it better. So this is how we'll be talking today only about the gastrointestinal system. That too, I will not touch more upon the colonic malignancies, perforation, etc., which I had discussed when I took the large intestinal obstruction. So with this background, you know the most common source of infection whenever we talk about abdomen means first thing everybody talks about perforation, and then we talk about gangrene of the intestines. Then we talk about surgeons worry all the time. Whenever a post-operative patient is not improving, we always think that is there any anastomotic leak? You have so many acute inflammatory conditions there, including appendicitis, Meckel's, cholecystitis, diverticulitis. So many are there. So we'll be quickly touching upon each one of them so that it helps you. Now, how bad can be the sepsis? Just to give a small example here, you see that how bad can be the sepsis. So in one case, you see that anastomotic leakages happened, and you see that fecal and feculent material is coming. Another is purely an iatrogenic situation where after a laparotomy, a large mop was kept. Nobody will keep it purposefully, but somehow it was not noticed, and sepsis continues. Very often that is what happens the next. So now come to the, if you do not treat, that is what will happen. Sepsis itself will take into autocannibalism, and result is sepsis, ongoing sepsis, and it may require an exploration again. Now we'll classify. It's broadly classified into uncomplicated. When you say uncomplicated, means involves only one organ and it does not spread into peritoneum. The second one is a complicated one, where infection proceeds beyond the organ into the peritoneum, causing localized or generalized peritonitis, as happens in a perforated duodenal ulcer, etc. It can also be classified into primary, where the gut is normal, gut is not the source, where there's no breach there. Secondary, definitely GIT, there is a perforation or a translocation, and there's also called as tertiary, we will see later, and there's also called as sterile. These are the few things you should remember. So quickly, primary means it's a bacterial infection, usually by single. You heard of pneumococcal peritonitis, staphylococcal peritonitis, gonococcal peritonitis. without the loss of integrity of the GI tract. There are also few examples of cirrhotic patients with ascites, patients with the peritoneal dialysis, etc. Now, secondary peritonitis means I mentioned to you, there is a loss, and tertiary usually happens after 48 hours. Even after you have done an adequate control of secondary peritonitis. A perforated duodenal ulcer, you have cleaned it, you have given a nice peritoneal wash, you have kept it dry, you have given antibiotics, still the infection is continuing, whatever may be the drug resistance, that's what is called a tertiary. We'll be talking about it a little later. So there's also called as ongoing. You know, there's a little bit of overlap here. It's not a different disease, but it's a secondary peritonitis only, but taking longer time. Organisms may be resistant. In that situation, you may have to look into antibiotics, do the culture again. Every day, I think every time surgeon will experience this. In simple words, during the rounds, we say patient is not improving. That's what is ongoing peritonitis. Now we'll go to quickly pathophysiology. I think few terminologies, I think all of you know, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, where there is a temperature, leukocytosis, and is the initial part of any infection. Sepsis means, you know, there is always organisms there, and that ultimately results in a hypoperfusion. The important things to look after here is aerobes and anaerobes. They are, you know, they act as synergistic. There's what is one mechanism called as encapsulation of the anaerobic bacteria. So the drugs may not act there. That's how they starts with the virulence factor. And they produce so many factors here. You can see the list here, starting from immunoglobulin proteases, coagulation promoting spreading factors, hyaluronidase, so many factors. These are all responsible for spreading of the infections. More importantly, there are few recognized inflammatory mediators. Cytokines, you heard of the cytokine storm in the COVID infections, something like that. Cytokines, chemokines, addition molecules, so many gases are produced. I mentioned you sometime translocation of bacteria. Even if you control the sepsis, there could be still a translocation of bacteria. So from the mucosal barrier, mucosal through the mucosa, and resulting in ultimately septic shock. There is also increased level of plasma lactate or negative base excess, also called as base deficit. These are all what happens in a septic shock. So definitions are already, you know, sirs. So when you have a life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by dysregulated host response to infection, this is what has been called as a septic shock. So it's a life-threatening infection. Definition of organ dysfunction. There are some scores mentioned here. One of them called as SOFA score. So we'll be talking about it a little later from the postgraduate point of view. When you are asked for a full essay, you should be able to write, these are some of the scores. Basically, in a gram-negative shock, these are the endotoxins, lipopolysaccharide in nature. So this is what have been well recognized as the prime stimulus in a development of a sepsis. So from the SIRS, we have moved to sepsis. Now, once you say septic shock, this is what is the definition. The patient requires vasopressor requirements to maintain mean arterial pressure of 65 millimeters of mercury. Small keyword here is 65 millimeters of mercury or greater. And serum lactate, this is one of the important things, greater than 2 millimoles per liter in the absence of hypovolemia. So serum lactate levels has been given here. You can see the levels I have mentioned to you. So if anything more, then you should suspect it could be a septic shock. So 65 millimeters of mercury is one keyword here. And second is the serum lactate levels. So this is what are the some of the important risk factors. Figures are self-explanatory, but I'll quickly go through here. Some genetically, some people may be predisposed. Aging factor, acquired immunosuppression. These are some of the diseases which apply to everywhere, you know, diabetes, alcohol, cancers, medication. There are some risk factors here, especially colons. males, male, age patient smokers, on-table hypertension, relatively causing a bowel ischemia. Patient is on steroids. Now, the other things for sepsis are, you can see here, lung infections. Any patient who is in ICU for a longer time, COPDs, aspiration, you shift the patient when the pill removed. I'll give an example of whatever surgery you have done. Aspiration, acid aspiration syndromes. Then catheters. I'm not talking urosepsis today. You know, these are some of the infections. So this is how, so risk factors for development of sepsis. One should be careful. So whenever there is a risk factor for, we divide them into high risk. So what do you mean by high risk? We already mentioned few things like immunosuppression. So in such patients, it's better that we try to put scoring systems. There are very many scoring systems which I will be speaking. One of them called as Apache, sequential organ function syndromes, SOFA scores. Or somebody may come late to the hospital. He comes after 24 hours. In fact, one of the scores called a Jabalpur score for a peptic ulcer, he takes into consideration that. And there's also a risk in a healthcare infections, because hospital is one of the areas where also you get a lot of infection than a community acquired. So this is what we should try to understand, the difference between hospital versus community. So what is the problems here? You know, onset is so rapid. You take an example of acute perforated DU, volvulus, interception, everything is so mesenteric thrombosis. Even a diabetic patient with acute cholecystitis, they can go develop so rapidly sepsis. You can lose them within no time, 2 or 3 days for that matter. So severe signs of local inflammation, systemic inflammation, and hypertension, hypoperfusion, oliguria, especially in gram-negative shock. Early feature is hypertension and oliguria. On the other hand, the gram-positive shocks, they may go for respiratory failure, lactic acidosis. These are all the important things which we have to take care during the intra-abdominal sepsis. So, you know now what is SIRS, what is sepsis, what is septic shock. You know what is primary peritonitis, secondary peritonitis, and tertiary. I think I'll quickly go to scoring systems. These are all given in all the standard books, all the journals, internet availability. But I want you to become sensitive about the scoring systems so that you can also try to implement in your colleges, so as to patients should get the ultimate benefit of that. So broadly, is a general scoring systems, what they call as ICU scores, or there is any peritonitis specific. This is on the other side. Now, general scoring system, you can see here, Apache, all of you know. And also there's one called a SAP score, simplified acute physiology score. It's simplified, no doubt, but it has got a lot of variables. But they're all for the first 24 hours of ICU stay, and they may be applicable in peritonitis. Now, you have got also peritonitis here, Mannheim peritonitis index score. SOFA score I have already mentioned to you. Then there is a peptic perforation scores called as Boyer score, or that's called a pulp score. You know, that's a perforated peptic ulcer score, also called as Boyer score. Also, this called a Jabalpur peritonitis index. So, 1985, Kanas et al. Has been described this. At least one scoring system, I think you should know, most commonly asked is Apache 1 and 2. So at least these are some of the variables. These are done in every ICU. Everything will be available: sodium, potassium, creatinine. So there's nothing to by heart here. Scoring systems are available. But as a postgraduate, you need to know these things, how it is calculated, how it is done. And the score is not recalculated. That's what is important. By definition, they are all admission scores. Now, there is another score for the local peritonitis here when the organ fails. That's called Mannheim peritonitis index. Not that complicated. You can see here, patient has come more than 24 hours later. He has got a malignancy, source of sepsis, fecal peritonitis, generalized peritonitis. So presence of organ failure. So in other words, You depends upon the case. You can put a score system here. Now, what is SOFA score? As I mentioned to you, Manning-Perrotton index is one type of a score. This takes individual here. For example, respiratory, cardiac, hepatic, coagulation. It also takes into consideration few other things which have been mentioned here. So that's what is the sequential organ failure assessment score, also called as SOFA score. So you can put a MPI, Manning-Perrotton index score, or a SOFA score for, say, organ failures, or for a other patient, as I told you, you can put Apache score, or for your postgraduate thesis, for the new postgraduates, one of you can take up one of these also. Now I will come to this perforation because that's one of the most common complication of a peptic ulcer. They have a morbidity of 20 to 50%, and look at the mortality here. You know, it can go up to 3 to 40%. So it's extremely important, you know, to prognostify them. You can give any one of these scores, including Apache I mentioned to you, but there are specific mention to peptic ulcer perforations. As I mentioned, the PULP score is there, Boyer score is also there. So these are the ones which are commonly used. Now look at this slide. I just given it for you to just to know what has been taken in the Boyer score presentation, shock, comorbidity. Jabalpur, Sharma et al., they studied few cases, and they have also given some amount of called a Jabalpur index. So it's our score takes admission to because what happens in Indian scenario, patient comes little late to the hospital, you know, more than 24 hours. Age, heart rate, creatinine. So these are the factors which are considered, and that's how the scoring system has been evolved, and they have got a good correlation with the mortality and morbidity of this patient. So these are the few scoring system, easy to put, you can practice. I mentioned you sometimes by health care associated infection. It's that's what I said, you know, it's more serious than a community here. So it happens in the hospital, IV lines, central lines, catheters, dialysis catheters, patient is on chemotherapy, radiotherapy, etc. In all these patients, always remember to treat the multi-drug resistant organisms. This is one of the common problems, and Candida infections. So this is fungal septicemias. These are all known today in the ICU setups. So one has to be extremely careful about that. So I have given you now some of the important features like classification of peritonitis, source of infections, we'll be talking about it. I have mentioned to you about the scoring systems which are commonly given for patients who come to you in casualty from the GI sources. So if there is any one or two questions, I will take at this stage related to whatever I have spoken, right? I'll just give 1 or 2 minutes so that you'll be able to ask me one or questions. All right, we'll proceed. Now, you are working in a emergency triage now. So one of the important things you should remember that no patient will come and tell you I have got peptic ulcer perforation or cholecystitis. You'll only show that right hypochondric pain. So as a postgraduate, a quick, easy way to remember, just look at those 10 pieces there. So it will give you some quick assessment of causes of abdominal pain in general, especially medical causes. Starts from the pleurisy to pneumonia, preherpetic neuralgia. Very often acute cholecystitis has been confused, especially before the vesicles appear. Purpura causing abdominal pain. Port spine is a TB spine with a radiation pain. Porphyria, pheochromocytoma. Plumbum is lead basically. Watch industries, they have got a problem of this lead colics. Pancreatitis, polyserositis syndrome. With the increased incidence of leptospira, all this dengue, etc., etc. They can also have pleural effusion, peritoneal fluid. They can present as abdominal pain. You do a sonologist, they will do some, they said fluid is present. And they all, even they say that deep, deep palpation probe tenderness is there, counts are high. So that's what I was trying to tell you, adding confusion. So it's important to realize that these are the possibilities in acute abdomen or source of infection. Let us not do the blunders of operating on any one of these, especially with the polyserositis syndrome. So always remember, when a patient has got fever first, it most probably it's a medical cause. All surgical sources start with the pain in the abdomen, right? Yes. So you are looking for a dehydration here, and this is a typical, mesenteric ischemia or pancreatitis patient. Jaundice, RT showing a altered blood here, abdominal distension. These are the few images. So as I mentioned to you, the onset is so rapid. Patient has got fever, tachycardia, and tenderness, rebound tenderness, hypotension, oliguria, lactic acidosis, organ failure. So this is how abdominal source of infection can present with. So remember, so earlier you diagnose, early treatment, and that is good for the patient. If you delay this, invariably they go for organ failure, and once it organ failure goes, the mortality steeply climbs up. If the 2 or 3 organs, means almost 70 to 80% mortality. So all of you know, these are some of the common important conditions which are in the abdomen. A quick look at them. Look for this intercostal tenderness, look for cholecystitis, look for rebound tenderness. There's a feculent means interstitial obstruction, sigmoid here left side, maybe a left-sided diverticulitis, or it could be appendicitis. So these are the few quick points you should know in the abdomen. This is how you make a diagnosis of some source of infection you are looking in the abdomen. So we have come to now reasonable conclusion that this is probably acute abdomen, and some source you may be having a doubt whether it is appendicitis, or whether it is a cholecystitis, or whether it is some other source. I have mentioned to you in the beginning, I am not talking about today non-gastrointestinal systems such as liver abscess or maybe bile leak from the biliary tract. I am not talking about pancreatitis, urosepsis, and gynec sepsis. So today talk is only confined to gastrointestinal system. So patient has come, you always do the common blood test, including total count, differential count, C-reactive protein. Its importance will be told to you later. Better ask in the beginning. Later the values shows that ongoing inflammation, and ask for this common investigation which are available. Ultrasound is extension, easily available. You can be portable anywhere. No radiation hazards. Pregnant lady, women, especially women, you have appendicitis, always you have a doubt. There's something related to ovary, excellent it is, or maybe tubes there, or mid-menstrual cycle, ovulation, etc. So ultrasound is extremely useful. What about CT scan? Definitely more reliable. You have a doubt when you do a ultrasound about the diagnosis. Yes, you always ask for a CT, especially in appendicitis. Somehow, if the clinical approach is good, if you find if you have no Alvarado scoring, I have not given it. Everyone knows it almost matches with your clinical sign symptoms. Ultrasound says there's a ficcolith. I think it's not required to do CT scan unless you are really equivocal about it. But remember, CT has got a radiation hazard of 200 X-rays. So that's also important. MRI is indicated in pregnant women because there's usually no radiation hazard. So I mentioned to you already, CT has got higher sensitivity, but radiation exposure. Ultrasound is subjective. So do ultrasound. You are not sure, of course, then CT is required. Don't delay CT scan because it can delay the treatment also as and when required. So some of the important one case, if you see X-ray here, it shows a ficcolith. You don't have to worry in such situation. A large ficcolith at the base, definitely a strong indication. you can go ahead and do the appendectomy. What about MRI? You know, generally, first of all, it is not available in most of the hospitals. There's a factor of movement here, cost factor also. However, it's indicated in pregnant patient when ultrasound is inconclusive, where you cannot do the CT scan. It's ideal that you go ahead for a MRI. Sensitivity for even appendicitis, it is quite good, because one of the complications a pregnant women develop, a common complication, in fact, during the pregnancy, is acute appendicitis. So you cannot do the CT scan, and ultrasound is sometimes equivocal. So there is a role for MRI when it is available in very selected patients. So you take a chest X-ray, you can see a thin crescent here. That's what you should always tell. Collection of the free gas. It's the gas which has escaped there. Under the right dome we look, because usually not necessarily that in every patient you need to have the gas under the diaphragm. So it's possible. You may miss it about 10 to even 20% sometimes. So this is another patient showing a gas fluid level. It's a subphrenic abscess, a source of the abdominal source of infection. A lady was taking a reverse and had a tummy injury. Initial ultrasound said normal, and CT showed, you can see here, a small perforation in the almost near the central tendon there. It was actually a case of a transverse colonic perforation, very small, which got immediately sealed off. The investigation of a choice, if you have a suspicion of a left-sided diverticulitis, I'm talking about sigma diverticuli, is the CT scan. You can see here collection there, see there. So on the left side, is a very important to make a diagnosis. There's no generalized peritonitis, so this is a diverticulitis here. Excellent investigation. Even ultrasound can be picked, but you suspect a gallbladder perforation. Acute cholecystitis patient. Okay, there are stones. You are managing conservatively. Patient deteriorating. More septic signs. Diabetic, let us say. As per the CT scan, you can see here a perforation there. Can you see that? There's a wall here. There's a breach there. So one of the very important investigation for a gallbladder perforation as a source, that is the again CT scan here. I have discussed with you mesenteric ischemia when I took the intestinal obstruction. However, just for a quick revision, it's an intramural gas in the wall. Is gas in the wall. It's not a one which has escaped outside. Pneumatosis. You can have a gas within the portal vein. Of course, it can also diagnose perforation, especially mesenteric ischemia. You take a simple X-ray, and bowel wall thickening, prominent folds. So many information you can get even with a plain X-ray abdomen. So look here, you can see here intramural. Actually, it's in the wall here. And you can see here multiple gas fluid levels and a lot of air. It was actually, these are not air inside. This is air inside here. These are all air inside, but that is in the wall. Intramural, showing that progressively worsening ischemia. So extremely useful plain X-ray. Yes, you will definitely do CT scan, not that you will not do. This patient was initially not diagnosed as mesenteric ischemia. You can see, as you see in the first picture, somebody diagnosed intestinal obstruction. That gas thin line was missed and patient worsened, and then this X-ray was done. Of course, sigmoid and cecal volvulus, large coffee bean appearance, is a cecal volvulus turning to the almost to the left hypochondrium, presenting as a dilated gas shadow there. So these are the few information you can get. A very interesting case. Patient was having known case of asthma, and a patient had breathing difficulty. Patient landed in the Department of Medicine with the abdominal pain. See, pain appeared first, but he was actually breathless, and the history was he took a large meal. There's no history of alcohol, because especially when such patients, first thing you ask is pancreatitis. Patient had vomiting food particles, etc. And he also gives some history, such history recurrently. for which a general practitioner used to give omeprazole, and tachypnea was there, and X-ray was taken. It was the surprise. You can see here so much collapse there. All intestinal loops have gone inside. Simple chest X-ray, and obviously it was a case of a diaphragmatic hernia. You can see here, this is the left hemithorax and containing stomach, etc. So it's important here that simple chest X-ray also can help you in the diagnosis in very often. Yes, when you have any doubt, you will no doubt use a ultrasound guided aspiration, and you take a frank pus. That means you know that we are dealing with the abdomen as a source of infection and requires immediate treatment. When in doubt, always, even a CT scan can miss an ileal perforation in 10 to 20% of the patients. Sonologists can miss. Trauma, I'm not talking about trauma but today, but trauma, even a small ileal perforation, enteric or even a tubercular, there is a possibility. When in doubt, always, if you find rebound tenderness or even a tenderness, CT may be reported as normal, but you better select this patient for laparoscopy. It can diagnose pus, bile, food particles. If anything is there, that means patient has got a definite source of infection and it requires urgent laparotomy. So see the accuracy there, almost 86 to 90%. So when in doubt, explore, still good. Only we have added now a diagnostic laparoscopy and proceed, right? So this is how you go ahead. And before we start the treatment, again, if there is anything anyone wants to ask related to investigations or classifications, scoring system, before we go take up individual cases, what will you do, right? I invite one or two questions. If anyone is wants to ask question, please unmute and ask.
Yeah, Nina.
Sir, what you say is a diagnostic laparoscopy. You
Yes.
mean that it is a diagnostic laparoscopy before doing the laparotomy, right?
That is when in doubt. I have already told you, when in doubt. Okay.
Okay.
CT says appendicular perforation. CT says ileal perforation. And if you are a good laparoscopic surgeon, you can always do a laparoscopy and close the duodenal perforation. I'm not talking controversies here. Okay. The context in which I mentioned was all diagnosis, all the investigations are equivocal. Then you are straight away do a laparoscopy, and you may be able to identify pus. You are not very good in, say, laparoscopic closure of the or resections. Open the patient. It is an indication for laparotomy. Yes. Okay. Right. So now, I'm going to touch upon little important ICU points here. I hope I request all of you to concentrate for some time. Today, the word which is expected from you is what's called early goal-directed therapy. What will you do? So it should be early. You know, golden time is always we talk less than 6 hours. Our patients, most of the time they come late, doesn't matter. But from the time they have come, always think of a broad spectrum antibiotics. Always keep it in mind. Always, I have given you fungal, even atypical organisms to be keep in mind. Now, just look at that. Today, central venous pressure, yes, you can always monitor, no problem about that. But today, what is important is intravenous, inferior vena cava diameter by using ultrasound. So this is an important issue of venous return and for the perfusion. We'll talk little more details as the slides come on. Nutrition is a big chapter, which is beyond my limits, but I've added just one slides here. And last one is ultimate, that is your source control. So We'll take up this one by one. Antibiotics. Now, there are one thing you should remember, that whenever there is so much necrosis, debris in the peritoneal cavity, there's an acidotic medium, antibiotics are ineffective. That's the first thing you should realize. Even an intraperitoneal pus has got low pH. You know why? Because of limited vascularity, even a phagocytosis, all of you know about the phagocytosis, is also diminished. And there's high concentration of beta-lactamase enzymes. So the organisms are so powerful, our antibiotics may not work. Source is always polymicrobial, and all of you know that E. coli, anaerobic organisms, enterococci, these are all the important source in our GI tract, also called a gram-negative sources more. So a general principle I have given you here, you look after the gram-negative means aminoglycosides, you can use it, extremely useful, provided you look after the renal dose. If in case if the patient has got renal failure, please take a nephrologist's opinion and titrate the dose, because otherwise straight he will go for renal failure. Remember, sepsis, diabetes, hypovolemia, increasing creatinine, enough to cause a renal shutdown. So little be careful about this. Cephalosporins, yes, definitely useful drugs. Anaerobes, so many generations are there, so I can't give you all the details about those. So I think you can always refer. Anaerobes means bacteroids or Clostridium, etc. We give metronidazole. Candida is more common in a tertiary peritonitis. I'll be speaking about it at the end. Venoms can be used as a single agent in a high-risk enterococcus. And cephalosporins can be combined with the metronidazole. So these are some of the guidelines which have been given. But I think every hospital will have own what is called infectious committee, will have their guidelines. What is prevalent in your theaters or in your in ICU or hospital, that is what is recommended. Now there are one thing about what's the empirical. So for example, a patient who has come to you, you have done the resection anastomosis and he leaks. For resection anastomosis, you might have treated with the cephalosporin and metronidazole. And such postoperative patient, you know that he is leaking from the colon. You know very well, or leak from the, let us say, terminal ileum. Following a enteric fever, enteric ulcer, you have resected anastomosis. You know the organism is Enterococcus. And recommendation is straight away go for piperacillin and tazobactam. I hope it's clear. So you have got a multi-drug resistance. Sometimes you get, I think you can straight away go for even a vancomycin resistant enterococci, go for linezolid. Then you have got multi-drug resistant organism, extended spectrum of beta-lactamase. They are called ESBL. So you try carbapenems. And you have got even carbapenem resistance. You try with the colistin and tigecycline. So endless antibiotics are there. It should be used judiciously. And let me tell you at the end of the day, for a simple cases, even a ampicillin, gentamicin, metronidazole can give as good results of a duodenal ulcer perforation. It doesn't have to take a very high level of antibiotics, and so that it slowly they become resistant. So these are the guidelines which have been given. So follow hospital policies, right? The next question which is commonly asked is how long you give. So when there is a presence of bacteremia, as I said, bacteremia, it is minimum 2 weeks. You have a appendicitis which is only limited to the appendix. Even 1 dose is enough, because there is no ongoing infection, or even there's no ongoing peritonitis. In all cases where there's a spread of infection, minimum 2 weeks is required, especially when there is bacteremia. Now, as I mentioned to you, intra-abdominal infection, especially in ICUs, especially hospital-acquired infection, patient is taking steroids, patient has undergone organ transplantation, he has got some liver disease, whether it's cirrhosis or any other disease, previous antimicrobial therapy is received, and such patients are highly vulnerable for resistant pathogens. So you should be aware of this. If patient does not show improvement within 1 or 2 days, you may have to change the antibiotics in such cases. Now come to another most important concept in treating this patient, and that is intravenous fluids. Just look at these 4 headings, concentrate for some time. If you are asked to write about the fluid therapy in a septic shock, these are the 4 headings on which you should write. Patient has come to casualty, your role is resuscitation. After resuscitation, for say quickly, you have to maintain. After the maintaining, you might have removed the source, etc. You have to replace for the losses. After that, nutrition or in a combination. So please divide them like this, so no confusion. These are some ICU guidelines which have been given. So resuscitation, maintenance, replacement, nutrition. These are the 4 headings. Now, I think all of you know also I mentioned with the first goal directed treatment. Now one of them is a goal directed fluid therapy. I have a small controversial point here, but for postgraduates, just concentrate on that. When you get a patient in a casualty ICU, with hypoperfusion, of course, sepsis with hypoperfusion, you start with the 30 ml per kg of crystalloids should be given within the first 3 hours. Look at that, per kg. Per kg means if patient is 60 kg means, you know, it becomes 1800 ml in first 3 hours. This was what was recommended. This has been questioned. I'll talk about it till later. Still, for the time being, goal directed fluid therapy original concept is 30 ml per kg is the recommendation, and later you do additional fluids by frequent assessment of hemodynamic status, right? So one keyword here is goal direction, and the volume is 30 ml per kg, and the fluid that is given is crystalloid. Now we'll come to the next slide. So how do you assess the hypoperfusion in casualty quickly? So these are the issues. Cold, clammy extremities, blood pressure is low, lactate is high. Is a lactate high is an indirect evidence of a hypoperfusion. There may be one organ failure, like let us say oliguria, and they have identified a source. Let us say perforated diabetic lung. Now, I was just now given you some guidelines to say you start with 30 ml, but this has been challenged now, because what they say is now massive overload is harmful. They're saying called as no one size fit all formula. You know, one patient, you cannot have everything will not fit in this. So approach to fluid and vasopressor therapy should be individualized based on clinical features and hemodynamics. This is the latest guidelines from the Surviving Sepsis campaign. So in the goal directed therapy, you start from the 30 ml per kg crystalloids. Now it becomes, they say it is too much. So now you assess them clinically and hemodynamics and do what? There are a few things here. Norepinephrine should be initiated early and give the crystalloid bolus. You know, don't aim at giving 1500 ml in 3 hours. As well, you give 200, 500 ml in hour, see the response. That's a very important thing. When we were postgraduates, our senior professors used to tell us, shock patient, raise the legs. Now this has come back in a big way in a survival sepsis campaign. Passive leg raising means what? If you raise it, almost 200, 300, 500 ml of the blood can go into circulation, means it's a reversible fluid challenge. I hope you understood the meaning of these two terminology. Instead of you loading with the fluids, you just do this reversible fluid challenge, and at the same time assess stroke volume. For that you need to have an echocardiogram here, IVC diameter, you can use an ultrasound. So, and these are some of the other things which you have to do. The stroke volume only, mean arterial pressure, CVP I have mentioned to you in the initial slide. no harm in doing a CVP. In fact, it is recommended, but don't rely too much on CVP. IVC diameter is the one which you can do it. Passive leg raising you can do. Instead of you giving 30 ml per kg in 3 hours, try that. Give in one bolus, see for 1 hour, give another bolus, and do this. So these are some of the latest recommendation as far as the IV fluids are concerned. So you have always a question now. What do you give? Always we give Ringer's lactate, and some of the patients have got hepatotoxic, whatever be the reasons. So liver may not be able to metabolize the lactates. In that situation, in ICU setups, Ringer's acetate is given. It's available. One thing you people should always remember, glucose has got no role for resuscitation. And you have a balanced salt solution is better than the saline, because saline means it always contain lot of salt there. So it can give rise to hyperchloremic acidosis, even hyperkalemia. Now, albumin for an acute case, immediately there is no role. However, you have been treated the patient, source control has been done, severe hypoalbuminemia, maybe he was having chronic disease, then he has perforated, then you can give all those earlier used hydroxyethyl starches, etc. They are usually contraindicated because they are also nephrotoxic. So ideal solution is Ringer lactate. If not Ringer acetate, you can use saline, but you should know what is the problem of saline. Glucose is not the drug. 30 ml per kg is the goal-directed fluid therapy. Now it has been changed to boluses given in 3 different installments. Now we'll go to maintenance. So resuscitation over. Maintenance is like in terms of body weight here you can give it. Now if patient requires dextrose also, because you need to give him some energy, and potassium and sodium, they have also been given. So how much is the dosage also written here. So one should be careful to give them. This is now for maintenance purposes. Now replacement. So second day or a third day, obviously he is losing some fluid there. There may be a drain there, stoma, fistula, fever, polyuria. So many things will happen in the post-operative period. That's why we call as intake output chart. So you have to correct them. That is what we mean by replacement. So when you replace here, isotonic balance solution is the best one here. So if you have got a loss of chloride, especially gastric fistula, etc., then of course you need to give a solution containing more chloride. Otherwise, again, Ringer lactate, you need to have energy. Dextrose is also added at this stage of replacement. So I hope it's clear now. Resuscitation, maintenance, replacement. Now, what is this passive fluid therapy? What is called as a ROSE concept. So just not difficult at all. See here, resuscitation has been already done. 30 ml as I mentioned to you, but with some pinch of salt. Or what is the hemodynamic you have monitored? Blood pressure, fine. Or 69 millimeters of mercury, I have told in the initial slide. Or urine output. Very good, simple things. Now what is optimization? So you have to optimize now fluid therapy to hemodynamics, correct? That's what you have done in the maintenance phase. Now you have done stabilization. That's what you have done later, replacement, no? Because of the stoma, fever, drains, etc. Now, what has come is the last one. What is this evacuation? So why that goal-directed 30 ml per kg was challenged? Because so much loading in the first 3 hours of resuscitation, the edema accumulates in the bowel, even in the peritoneal cavity, suture lines may leak, and later there are mortality was high in those patients. What is the meaning of that evacuation? Means actually de-resuscitation. So what you have to do is, now it is not goal-directed fluid therapy. Look here carefully. It is goal-directed fluid removal. This extra fluid you have to remove. That is the reason why This is 30 ml per kg has been rather challenged. So I hope it's clear. Resuscitation, optimization, stabilization, evacuation, right? So these are about the fluid therapy. So how do you know? So now combination of early adequate fluid to prevent hyperperfusion and cell damage and late conservative fluid management. So that is what is the balance one should have in managing these patients with the septic shock when they come to the casualty or ICU setups. I hope the fluid thing is very clear. So how do you know that you are given adequate fluids? I have mentioned to you, if you have the facility, stroke volume I already mentioned, inferior vena cava diameter ultrasonography, serum lactate, and if you have a esophageal Doppler, to check the left atrial pressure monitoring. Now, following were not considered: CVP and central venous oxygen saturation. But no harm in doing CVP and the central venous oxygen saturation, right? Why the target of 65? Organ failure I mentioned to you. One who requires a vasopressors, norepinephrine, noradrenaline is given. So why? To maintain that minimum is 65. Because if you give more, say around 85, it itself causes arrhythmias. So this also causes a risk of fibrillation. That is the reason why our target is to maintain at 65 millimeters of mercury, right? Energy, I mentioned to you, TPN itself is a big chapter. Let us not discuss more, but definitely he requires some. Sepsis is a catabolic event, all of you know. So much cytokines there, insulin resistance. More glucose means more carbon dioxide. Don't give too much of glucose. 50% should come from lipids. The usual kilocalories have been given here. So, is there a nutritional support? Yes, some of them, as I mentioned to you, who are having chronic disease like tuberculosis or malignancy might have perforated. So, if they would have lost more than 10% of body weight, malnutrition is a possibility. Now, again here, challenges. Albumin is not a proper marker of nutrition because it is influenced by many factors, acute or even chronic sepsis. So there are few things which you can do. BMI, body mass index, weight loss. I mentioned about usually weight loss, they will tell. Triceps fold thickness, muscle function. These are some equipments if you have got called a hand grip dynamometer. And what is interesting is nowadays, anyway you are doing a CT scan for a source, if you can request the sonology CT scan specialist, they can assess the lean body mass by CT scan that has got a relation with the nutritional assessment. So this is these are some of the recent guidelines. So before I go to the source control, because this is a topic, I finished antibiotics now, and the fluids, little bit of confusion may be there. So I request, if you have any questions, please ask me now. If you have any questions related to antibiotics or maybe whatever I have spoken related to fluids.
So will the choice of fluid vary depending upon the source, whether it's a small bowel perforation or a large bowel perforation, something like that, sir? Is there something specific like that?
At the time of, no. At the time, as I mentioned to you, patient has come to the intensive care, your answer should be straight away ringer lactate. I already told you, I already mentioned to you crystalloids. Crystalloids is the answer and ringer lactate is the ideal there. Otherwise, ringer's acetate. If
okay,
liver
sir.
is the, yeah.
Thank you.
But one thing is, don't start glucose. That's the first thing you should know.
Hello.
Yes.
Can I ask a question about the epinephrine?
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Epinephrine. When should I start epinephrine giving norepinephrine? I mean, when the patient arrives immediately with antibiotic and with fluid, or shall I like wait?
Both will go simultaneously, madam, because patient has got a hypotension shock and he has come to the casualty. immediate resuscitation, as I mentioned to you, target of 65 millimeters of mercury is the mean arterial pressure, start epinephrine. No issues. So you immediately. At same time, investigation, IV fluids, don't wait for the fluid to come. You no doubt start the fluid. I'm not trying to say that, but the whole process should go simultaneously. Resuscitation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Now, last important part is the source control. After that, I have some few case capsules. So you have got some diagnosis after the CT scan or ultrasound. So do a laparotomy. I will not bring controversies of laparoscopy, etc. Now you look for perforation, obstruction, gangrene, trace, esophagus. I'm not dealing with the esophageal perforation, etc. So stomach, duodenum, almost whatever possible till the upper pelvic brim you can go. Look all the organs. As soon as you may get some pus, send it for culture sensitivity. Don't forget that. Remove the source of infection. First cavities are open, and most important, last is the whatever procedure you do, resection, anastomosis, ileostomy, close with the peritoneal wash, what's been called a peritoneal toilet. You need to use a copious amount of saline here, maybe 8 to 10 liters. So when you have a generalized peritonitis, means it's a more problem. I think all of you know there is a rapid contamination. So there are various options are there in the sepsis. As I mentioned to you, resection. We'll take up one by one case, then we'll know. So that is how you go ahead with the generalized peritonitis. So source control, these are the principles I have given you. Now we'll take up one by one so that common conditions we'll talk about this with the case capsules in between. So all of you know, common problem is a peptic ulcer perforation. Duodenal ulcer perforation is still seen. Gastric ulcer also. Maybe iatrogenic following a polypectomy for a duodenum or a stomach, etc. Can be a gastric ulcer or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. You do a quick diagnosis of a severe pain, coffee ground vomitus there, hypotension. You know the 3 stages. Stage of typically chemical peritonitis, early stage. Then you have got a reaction or a dilution, and then you have got a peritonitis. Golden time is 6 hours to operate on this patients, right? So now just look at that example. Typically, young boy has come. So coffee ground vomitus. So your aim is, what's your diagnosis? Perforated ulcer. Do you have a differential diagnosis? Just ask a question to yourself. Any acute pancreatitis, you have to rule out. I already told you, severe abdominal pain, cholecystitis, pancreatitis. Of course, elderly people, ruptured aneurysm. You have suspected peritonitis, possibilities, how to proceed. So I think all of you know, as I already mentioned to you, I will not talk about antibiotics, etc. You already started resuscitation, fluids given, and you have taken X-ray and see only stable patient, you should make the patient to stand. Is a chest X-ray showing a gas under the diaphragm here. And if your patient cannot stand, lateral decubitus, still doubt, ultrasound is good also. I'll come to that. Otherwise, you have to ask for a CT scan. CT scan also may reveal that enough, even the site of the perforation. So lateral decubitus, right lateral, you can show the enough air is accumulated here. This is a large gastric ulcer. Look at the volume of the air there. If you also take a supine film, one sign they have described a regular sign. That's because the air is there outside as well as inside. So you can see the wall of the intestine. So because of the air which has escaped outside, this is the supine. These are the signs which have been described. Sometime for the quiz, it may be helpful. So will you do a CT scan in all patients? Definitely CT is more accurate. As I told you, hemodynamic unstable patient should never undergo CT scan. If a stable patient is there, air under the diaphragm is there, you do it so that it can guide you the incision. I will give an example. You have a DU perforation, you can put an upper midline. If a ileal perforation, you can put a lower midline incision. So CT scan can guide the incision, but look at that, it can detect even 5 cc of the free air in the peritoneum, right? So what you have done, laparotomy, laparoscopy, these are the things which, as everybody knows, put particles to drain out, wash it nicely. You will identify a perforation. You can see there. You take a PDS is the best here, or a Vicryl, and take 3 sutures, trim the edges, and suture it like a pyloroplasty so that you don't narrow the lumen. The whole purpose is don't narrow the lumen. You take a pedicle omentum there, which has been described also as Graham's patch, and there are very important precautions, you have to take. It should not be too tight. Sufficient tissue should be taken when you take a bite. So there is not much of a space there to go 1 centimeter, etc. So sufficient tissue. A very small perforation, simple suture is enough. You have a difficult suturing, you can take a pedicle omentum. Also has been used. Don't tighten, not tightly over the omentum, because then what happens? Omentum undergoes necrosis. Always rule out a carcinoma. If you have a doubt, large ulcer, gastric ulcer perforation, patient is fit, go ahead with the gastrectomy, whatever Billroth 1 or 2. So what is the advantage of laparoscopy? Which everyone knows, these are the advantage. The only thing is operating time, not much differences, may take more rather than the less. Otherwise, laparoscopy has an advantage. More importantly, you can, before putting an incision itself, when you have a laparoscope, you will avoid a big incision by identifying the site of perforation. What are the options? Difficult cases. These are only for postgraduate sake. Very complicated duodenal ulcer perforation. It gives way again. Sutured, big ulcers. This is what sometimes you may have to do 3 tubes. Duodenostomy, gastrostomy, jejunostomy for fits, and wait for 5 to 6 weeks later and do a formal gastrectomy, partial gastrectomy, etc. reconstruction. So this itself is a little complicated procedure. So these are to be done only when it has given way. Now, if a question is asked, is there a conservative line of management for a perforation? If there is a small perforation, imagine a patient is elderly, 70 years. He has no shock, no peritonitis. What happens sometimes is a small perforation gets sealed off immediately. So it may show air under the diaphragm. That doesn't mean that you should operate, because food contents and there's no spillage. No spillage because you are done a water soluble contrast. It has shown no spillage. You can always monitor what has been called as conservative line of management for a peptic ulcer disease, right? What is the definition of a giant ulcer? Look at that. Small means less than 1. Large means critical problems. I'm going to show you one case capsule now. Have a look at that case capsule. Okay, we'll just quickly go through. What are the options you have got? I mentioned to you that if you are able to not do a closure or it has re-leaked after 4 to 6 weeks, I mentioned about 3 tubes. These are the various options we already quickly mentioned to you. So I have no experience of any one of them except one Billroth 2 gastrectomy I have done, and also resuturing. But other things are, for the completion sake, I have brought it here. For the sake of postgraduates and everyone here, I have brought a one clinical case capsule where a 23-year-old male patient undergoes appendicectomy for a right iliac fossa pain, and appendix was slightly inflamed. Post-operatively, there was 200 ml of green colored fluid and became 600 ml. Operating surgeon elsewhere, he thought he would have injured the ileum and re-explode, but he did not have the facility for CECT. This is one of the problems in India also. He gave a lower midline incision. Initial first was appendicectomy, is a classical McBurney. Later he had done a lower midline and he caused some tears over the ileum and he did a limited colectomy. Look at that. So, and bile started continuing and he referred the patient to us. So when a patient comes to us, you can see those tubes there pouring out bile. When you see this kind of a picture, always remember it cannot be ileum. Ileal contents are little thicker and they are fecal type. So we suspected that something is wrong with him. Did a CT scan and it showed a leak from the duodenum, and this was the ongoing sepsis you can make out there, right? And this was on exploration, which we did. And see, I was hardly able to identify the area. This was the duodenal area. I just put some tube duodenostomy, but basically I drained the Morrison's pouch and ruled out other injuries. And this is something like a damage control I have done. This also word is used here. And after 6 weeks, I called him. I built up his nutrition. You can see here, I was able to identify the 2 openings. I was able to mobilize. There was an ulcer which was beyond the first and second part junction. I trimmed the edges. I was able to get a good suturing. I used the interrupted sutures here, and with the drain the cavity, feeding jejunostomy continued, and he recovered well. Why I have brought this here purposefully? To sensitize you to a concept called, it has been called as Valentino syndrome, also called as Valentino appendix. He was an Italian actor, and while shooting for one of the films, is actually Hollywood, and he had a peritonitis, and they did appendicectomy. Imagine there was no ultrasound there, nothing, and he later developed sepsis, and he died. And what he had was duodenal ulcer perforation. Friends, even today it happens. When you have got a large ulcer perforations, the fluid can gravitate down the paracolic gutters, can cause irritation in the right iliac fossa if you've not taken the history properly, or hurriedly, if you say counts are high, will operate without invest. Today it is less because of the ultrasound and a CT scan. So this is about the Valentino appendix. So these are about the peptic ulcer perforation. I would like to invite 1 or 2 questions or suggestions also from Dr. Radhakrishna. If you have got anything to talk about this peptic ulcer perforation and whatever I have spoken, please advise or suggest.
Sir, your talks are always masterly, and I think very, very good thought and preparation goes into your slides. They're so well balanced, and the whole subject is so well balanced. So there's not much for me to add to anything what you say, sir, because your talks are widely followed and widely looked up to.
Thank you, sir. How much time I have got now? Another 20 minutes?
Yeah. Please. The other issue is that,
yes.
Any topic you take up, whether it is obstetric jaundice or intra-abdominal infection, you make the whole thing complete and interesting. I mean, that is a big speciality you have, sir. So subject-wise, there isn't much I can sort of really comment on. It's a very complete lecture.
Thank you. So now in India, we have a problem of typhoid perforation, which all of you know, 2nd or 3rd week. There's a time that Zenker's degeneration happens. So clinically, there will not be much guarding. And I think all of you know typhoid causes bradycardia. So it adds some more confusion. And you say that admits in usually medicine ward. There's no guarding. Bradycardia is there. So I have not referred the patient. This is what usually happens. So what is important is to know that typhoid can give rise to perforation around 2nd or 3rd week there. And the one problem is these are all the patients can have myocarditis. So there is every possibility to avoid this congestive cardiac failure in this type of patient. Pathologists are able to coin a term just for the sake of postgraduate. It's not typhoid, it's not thyroid nodule, it's typhoid nodule. These are the macrophages containing bacteria, red blood cells, are debris from a small nodular aggregates to the Peyer's patches. That's where the necrosis happens and you get a typhoid perforation. What options you have got here? See here, very small perforation. Contamination is there. When you say small means 0.5. So you can do a simple closure. But if you have a doubt, edematous edge. Typhoid is a toxic fever with the high grade fever. You can always do ilioptransverse anastomosis if you have a doubt. Still I have a doubt, option is simple closure and ileostomy. If you feel patient is stable and only one ulcer, small perforation, but you have adjacent area also, there are some doubtful, you can do a resection anastomosis. Now the choice, is there any guidelines for that? Yes. You can put a Apache scoring now. I have already mentioned in the beginning about this acute physiology and a chronic health evaluation. This is a study here which quotes, when you have a perforation with or without anastomosis, you are done. 21 patient had Apache score of less than 10 and 9 had more than that. So simple closure. Now you have another one here. Resection anastomosis performed because of multiple perforation or a large perforation, by definition more than 2. So, or this is that paper which is telling about this course. When segment of the bowel appeared unhealthy, you can't do a simple closure. Or if there is Apache score is more than 10, you do ileostomy. So three things they have done. When your scores are less than 10 and when the scores are more than 10. When Apache score is more than 10, they have done, some of them are ileostomy they have done. So in other words, your patient is unstable, and if you feel that a large perforation is there, always protect the anastomosis, either do ileotransverse or ileostomy. That is what is the message from ileal perforation. Again, tuberculosis, I have spoken when I took the intestinal obstruction. These are the problems which you get in this, adhesions, etc. is usually a stricture causing perforation. The principles apply here also, same thing. Stable patient, resection, anastomosis, sometimes a limited colectomy, ileocolectomy, even sometimes you have a doubtful vascularity. Don't hesitate for exteriorization. You resect it, one end you can bring it out, another as a mucus fistula, and which you may have to go in again, do the anastomosis. So these are the options which are available for a terminal ileum. The problem in the terminal ileal perforations is some of them are very close to ileocecal junction, adds to again a perforation. So edema, unhealthy tissue, and a delay. These are all the factors which you decide. So put a scoring system, and large ulcers, scores are high, don't take a chance of a primary closure. Crohn's disease, I think all of you know, the aim is always to preserve the bowel. Yes, but if your patient has got an emergency, which happens in about 6 to 16% cases, this is the consensus, some guidelines from the European committee there. So symptoms of peritonitis means immediately surgery. You have to resect it. Again, principally, again a re-leak in these patients. So options are already I have mentioned to you. That is what you should keep. So I have given the 2 important causes, 3 actually: Crohn's, typhoid, and tuberculosis as far as the ileum is concerned, which are common problems. Now, I have not included trauma. More or less, it goes in a similar way. Only thing is trauma, the patient does not have a disease. It's a trauma causing a perforation. Invariably, simple closures are fine. Normally, we rarely do a ileostomy unless there are some other injuries, right? Now, colonic perforation in emergency case of carcinoma, I have already spoken. Now we are talking about a diverticular perforation, right? Remember, these patients are more sick. All of you know the load of bacteria, age of the patient, immunocompromised stature, diabetes. You have a mass of sigmoid, patient requires laparotomy, better resected. If there is a mass, what happens? Done, do you get just a colostomy. After you resect, now you have a problem, what to do? Either again 2-stage procedure of a Hartmann's you do, where you bring as a sigmoid colon out, and another side you close and do it later. Ulcerative colitis is a toxic megacolon. I mentioned some time back, subtotal colectomy with or without pouch, etc. Now a case capsule here. Look at this 75-year-old man, high risk. Already you know what is the high risk criteria here. He has got an intra-abdominal infection there and perforated diverticula. CT shows, you can see here, paracolic space collection. Obvious question which is asked is, do all diverticulitis with the perforation need to be managed by laparotomy? Obviously, the answer is no. It's a well localized one here. You know about Hinch's staging and classification. Please read about it. So what I'm going to give you some criteria which has been mentioned is, you have a patient who has got no generalized peritonitis, but a diameter of 4 to 6 centimeter collection. Even there is air in the pneumoperitoneum, it can be managed without laparotomy. This is what you should understand here. So you give a good antibiotics to cover those 3 organisms. I've already given in the initial part. Usually it can go okay, you can even add amikacin for that matter. Remember, 4 to 6 centimeter size, and even if air is present, but no generalized peritonitis. But if patient is high risk, I have already given to you all those criteria. Again, Apache will help you here now. Scores are high. Then even if the patient size of this abscess is 4 centimeter, etc., then probably you need to do antibiotics plus guided aspiration by using pigtail, etc. So this is of course not a sigma diabetic, it's a small intestine diabetic, it's not Meckel's. I just brought it because as also perforation, and this was actually a patient deteriorated, and there was one more diverticulitis which has caused generalized peritonitis, undergoes laparotomy. So what is the summary for diverticulitis? With the localized abscess, less abscess, good condition, antibiotics only, no drainage. Up to 4 centimeter, some people go up to 6. Percutaneous aspiration, collection more than 4 centimeter and has got fever. Resection and with heartburns, or still general condition is good, rarely resection anastomosis. All depends upon ultimately colorectal unit, surgeon's expertise, stable patient, contents, etc. So that's a summary about the diverticulitis. Appendicitis is the most common problem. So gold standard, all of you know, is emergency appendicectomy. But you can even treat with the antibiotics alone if there is no perforation, provided you need to tell the patient there could be a chance of a recurrence. You have an appendicular abscess, what will you do? Guided pigtail insertion. What do you mean by complicated appendicitis? I have given in the first slide where the infection has spread beyond organ to a peritoneal cavity. What do you do in such situation? This is some debate here whether to remove the appendix in a complicated appendicitis with the mass there. Several studies have proved non-operative treatment for an abscess. Non-operative, when you say, you can do a guided aspiration, but there's no role to do appendicectomy immediately. You can do it always later. That is what it is. But you have to look carefully for spreading peritonitis. The other one picture is not appendix, it's actually gangrenous Meckel's diverticulum. I mentioned during the interstitial obstruction when I took. Obviously, Meckel's produces more problems if it is inflamed or perforated. So it's better undergo immediate resection. So conservative treatment for appendicular abscess, because retrocecal is common, invariably it gets well localized. So you can wait or guided aspiration, go in later and do, but again expertise, some people can stickers has to be removed. So that's what I already mentioned to you. There's a big meta-analysis in 2010 with the 17 studies have got a benefit of not doing appendicectomy during the initial part of appendicular abscess, do it later where there's fewer complications. So policy should be stable patient with abscess. Even you can manage without aspiration. If there's a fever, aspirate, and otherwise explore the patient appendicectomy in cases of continuing sepsis. So these are the few guidelines about sepsis caused by appendicitis. So I'm not talking about pregnancy in details. What do you do for a pregnant patient with acute appendicitis? Laparoscopy, yes, definitely can be done, but please keep the patient informed. There's increased fetal loss. It is there as a matter of practice even in open, but comparatively, laparoscopic method has got a more fetal loss. Otherwise, laparoscopy definitely has an advantage in a expert hands. Gangrene bowel, superior mesenteric ischemia I mentioned in the last class obviously requires full evaluation whether say gangrenous portion has to be removed. CT scan is the gold standard. Dissection, anastomosis with or without stoma. I think I will not take much time here. But more importantly, one important issue is anastomotic leak. This is something which is a common problem, and every time we talk, when I do a anastomosis, patient is not doing well. Assistants will tell, sir, it could be due to lung infection, it could be due to catheter infection. I always tell that if our patient who has undergone anastomosis is not doing well, think of a leak. This is one of the common things we should know. Counts are high, urine output you measure, they might have gone for even renal failure. So these are some of the things about anastomotic leak, and how do you suspect, and what are the recommendations. So these are some of the guidelines here. So you see the percentage here. There is a delay in diagnosis of anastomotic leak because it's a post-operative patient. You blame the tachycardia to something, lung infection, temperature to urinary infection, and you say, sir, no guarding, no rigidity. Post-operative state itself is immunocompromised, pulse rate is not high. So when in doubt, do a CT scan. Drain is important, source of whatever material, and doing a procedure, whether to do again resection, all that is depends upon the condition of the patient. So these are the precautions you should remember whenever you operate on a patient. Albumin is low indicate chronic problem, like I mentioned tuberculosis malignancy. Presenting as acute abdomen. Sepsis is one of the dangerous things for anastomosis. You have a doubtful vascularity. You have done with the tension, you are not mobilized, let us say during right hemicolectomy, you might not have mobilized the colon properly. Your technique, too tight sutures, suture materials, all will add to anastomotic leak. But surgeon factor is the most important thing also here. So with this, I have concluded most of the things, but I asked some commonly asked questions and answers here. So very many times we asked all these questions. It will be there now. First, will you keep a drain or not? Again, a debatable issue. If you are feeling safe, you keep a drain. Sorry, don't keep a drain. You have any doubt, you keep a drain. But you also remember, drain can cause more damage. You know that anastomosis gets an additional blood supply from adhesions. We want adhesions. So some amount of leak is encouraged by a corrugated plastic drain. Look at that. So if you keep a, definitely avoid suction drains. If there's a urine or a significant bile leak, drain it. And vigilance in the post-operative period is very, very important. So what are the empirical antimicrobial therapy? I already mentioned to you. Once you say empirical, later always look at the culture and modify it. Always it is broad spectrum antibiotics. Don't wait, I will start it after the culture available. No, you know very, very well in your hospital what are the hospital policy. Intraoperative abscess, what is the recommendation now? You have got a sign of sepsis after surgery, CT guided aspiration of pigtail. You still have a doubt, you may have to do a laparoscopy and laparotomy. Remember, always more adhesions, interloopal collections. You will land up with doing more enterotomy. Always keep it in mind, inform the patient and take the consent. Only pelvic abscess, yes, you can drain to the rectum. So what is the best way to eradicate? Is the first surgery. First surgery is the best surgery. Anastomotic leak, I have already mentioned to you. The problems of anastomotic leak is always delay in the diagnosis. So kindly make a early diagnosis of anastomotic leak. How? What are the factors? As I mentioned to you, males, aged patient, smoking, these are strong for colorectal anastomosis. So never guarantee any patient that that I will cure you. No, as per anastomosis. Look at that percentage. You should know roughly when you talk about colon, 3 to 22%. So there is a gut mucosal ischemia also is responsible for perforation. When you are operating on a patient with the septic source, you have treated it, and doubtful signs to anastomotic leak. Do you have any marker, like we say no tumor marker? Yes. So there are about more than 30 studies which are proving about C-reactive protein here. So this is an important thing here. So rise of C-reactive protein between 2 days and 3, that can happen initially but slowly decline. But if it indicates persistent elevation after 5 days, that means there is a definite role. There is a definite intraperitoneal septic focus. So C-reactive protein is one of the useful markers. If you have facilities, I think one should do for CRP. Source control, 5 Ds you remember. I have given all the details to you. You have to debride them nicely. Device, I mentioned to you, whatever device patient has got, whether it's a foreign body including a mop, which is the source, means it has to be removed. It can be a mesh infection. I have not spoken about that. Intraperitoneal. Drainage of purulent cavities. All cavities, thorough search should be done. You have to do a decompression of the abdominal cavity as a whole. Sometimes the laparostomy may be required. Don't put too tight a suture in second time, third time. Of course, a definitive repair. These are the important components where you look after the source in abdominal sepsis. Last one word about what is tertiary peritonitis. We have spoken about primary, very easy. I have given example of cirrhosis patient with ascites developing a peritonitis is primary peritonitis. Secondary is the most common which we come across. Tertiary is something, see there you have treated a patient with the whatever peritonitis, all these systemic response syndromes, all those signs are continuing. You are treated well. You are given very good antibiotics. So what are the factors which can cause tertiary? So these are the things: malnutrition, multi-drug resistance, that all to be kept in mind. Somehow patient is not doing well. So that's what we tell. Again now, put the charts again. I told you in the original that man in peritoneal index, you put the scoring. C-reactive protein I mentioned. This is the time I mentioned in the initial stages. These are some of these bacteria. So when you have a patient who has undergone a surgery, maybe first time or even second time for a peritonitis, he is now showing again signs of, these are tertiary. So resistant organisms, the microbes have changed. So this is what is the list here, including fungus, and still they are not responding. Reoperate, and then you have got so many problems here. You may do some enterotomy, difficult abdomen, adhesions, incisions, exploration. Call help. Such patient better call help and never hesitate to exteriorize, and closure of the abdomen. You can close it. You need not close it. It's something like a Bogota bag you can apply. Some of these cases re-explodes for different reasons. See, they are so plastered here. You can't go in. You can see here plaques there. Bile is leaking. Bowel is stuck here. I think Harold Ellis made a very important statement in adhesions when he incised. He said better to leave the abdominal wall on the intestine rather than intestinal wall on the abdomen. What it means to say is avoid those enterotomies. And look at here, one patient who had a gangrene here, extensive gangrene. We did not have the classical Bogota bag. I think Bogota is the name of the person from Colombia. He has divided bag. Ordinary Euro bag, you can split it and you can use it. You can see the bowel there. You can see there. So these are some of the examples. You see that stoma is there. Still there is a leak there. Bile is coming out. So these are all difficult problems, but these are all source of intra-abdominal infection. Now, lastly, this is how the patients come. Remember that Valentino syndrome patient I mentioned to you? Fourth surgery we did. Fourth surgery, age was with him. And that's what the most satisfying moment for a sepsis, deathbed, walks home. It's a normal life. So, dear friends and students, I hope I have done my level best to get you some details about sepsis. I hope you know what type of peritonitis you are dealing with when you encounter a patient. You should know what is the pathophysiology I have given to you. All those three peritonitis, few scoring system, even if you can't by heart, doesn't matter, but at least one or two scoring system you should know to apply it in your ward. You should be able to a clinical examination and clinch the diagnosis, including looking at the hernial orifices, which is a mandatory. I have not mentioned here because this is not an intestinal obstruction, but source. You should know the fluid therapy. I have already given you guidelines. It is not early directed goal fluid therapy now. Actually, it is a late now. It is actually you are taking out evacuation therapy and source control and common conditions, and you should be able to manage them. So these are some of the references, whatever I was able to correct. And I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Radhakrishna, and again condolences to Professor Chandramouli. Thank you very much. Without any questions, and if any postgraduate clarification, yes, thank you. Any questions from postgraduates?
It's a wonderful lecture as usual, sir. I think it's a very thorough lecture. Any questions? I also request the postgraduates to give their opinion about comments about sir's lectures to his email. You can see his email on the slide. Please, if you have anything nice to write, please write to him. And thank you so much, sir, for your effort and for the time you spend on LGS. We are very honored. Thanks till we see you again in the next lecture. Thank you so much.